When the United States declared war against Germany in April of 1917, War Department planners quickly realized that the standing army of 126,000 men would not be enough to ensure victory overseas. The standard volunteer system proved to be inadequate in raising an army. So on May 18, 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, requiring all male citizens between the ages of 21 and 31 to register for the draft. Even before the act was passed, African American males from all over the country eagerly joined the war effort. They viewed the conflict as an opportunity to prove their loyalty, patriotism, and worthiness for equal treatment in the United States. Men of color have served in every American conflict since the Battle of Lexington in 1775. Both freemen and former slaves flocked by the thousands to wear the blue uniform of the United States in a conflict to make all men free. In 1917, men of color were ready to take up arms again. In 1917, there were 4 all-black regiments in the regular army, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and 24th and 25th Infantry. The men in these units were considered heroes in their communities. Within 1 week of Wilson's declaration of war, the War Department had to stop accepting black volunteers because the quotas for African Americans were filled. When it came to the draft, however, there was a reversal in the usual discriminatory policy. Draft boards were comprised entirely of white men. Although there were no specific segregation provisions outlined in the draft legislation, blacks were told to tear off one corner of their registration cards so they could easily be identified and inducted separately. Now, instead of turning blacks away, the draft boards were doing all they could to bring them into the service, Southern draft boards in particular. One Georgia County exemption board discharged 44% of white registrants on physical grounds and exempted only 3% of black registrants based on the same requirements. It was fairly common for Southern postal workers to deliberately withhold the registration cards of eligible black men and have them arrested for being draft dodgers. African American men who owned their own farms and had families were often drafted before single white employees of large planters. Although comprising just 10% of the entire U.S. population, blacks supplied 13% of inductees. While still discriminatory, the Army was far more progressive in race relations than the other branches of the military. Blacks could not serve in the Marines and could only serve limited and menial positions in the Navy and the Coast Guard. By the end of World War I, African Americans served in cavalry, infantry, signal, medical, engineer, and artillery units, as well as serving as chaplains, surveyors, truck drivers, chemists, and intelligence officers. Although technically eligible for many positions in the Army, very few blacks got the opportunity to serve in combat units. Most were limited to labor battalions. The combat elements of the U.S. Army were kept completely segregated. The 4 established all-black regular Army regiments were not used in overseas combat roles, but instead were diffused throughout American-held territory. There was such a backlash from the African American community, however, that the War Department finally created the 92nd and 93rd Divisions, both primarily black combat units, in 1917.
There were 2 combat divisions in the American Expeditionary Force. There was the 92nd Division and the 93rd Division. The 93rd was made up of 3 National Guard units and 1 unit of black draftees from the South. And the Harlem Hellfighters were the 15th New York National Guard, and it became the 369th U.S. Infantry. The 8th Illinois National Guard became the 370th U.S. Infantry. Then you had the 371st, which were the black draftees from South Carolina, I believe. And then you had the 372nd, which was made up of National Guard units from Ohio, Washington, D.C., Delaware, and a few other places.
On the 25th of March, 1917, the 1st D.C. Battalion had been the very first National Guardsmen mustered in for federal service. They were handpicked by the Secretary of War specifically because of their race as basically proof of their national origin as Americans and their loyalty to the flag, something that they couldn't guarantee in the white regiments because they had so many foreigners in their ranks. And of course, back in those days, it wasn't like now. You emigrated, you went back and forth, and really nobody cut ties with the old country. So they couldn't trust that Private Schultz in the umpty-umph infantry regiment wasn't going to let his cousin Heinrich just sort of slip in the back door of the Capitol and leave a bomb under the steps. Hence the choice of colored troops.
With the creation of African American units, there also came the demand for African American officers to command the troops. The War Department thought the soldiers would be more likely to follow men of their own color, thereby reducing the risk of any sort of uprising. Most leaders of the African American community agreed, and it was decided that the Army would create a segregated but supposedly equal officer training camp. In May 1917, Fort Des Moines opened its doors to black officer trainees. Approximately 1,250 men attended the camp in Des Moines, Iowa. Although African Americans were earning higher positions in the Army, that did not necessarily mean they were getting equal treatment. Black draftees were treated with extreme hostility when they arrived for training. White men refused to salute black officers, and black officers were often barred from the officers' clubs and quarters. The War Department rarely interceded, and discrimination was usually overlooked or sometimes even condoned. Because many Southern civilians protested having blacks from other states inhabit nearby training camps, the War Department stipulated that no more than 1/4 of the trainees in any Army camp in the U.S. could be African American. After intense training, abuse by white officers, and fights with white civilians, word finally came for them to prepare for overseas duty. They were going to France to fight in the war, or so they thought. With so much trouble going on around them, the 15th New York stayed in camp and waited for official orders to send them to France and into the fight. The War Department worried about a white backlash in the Army and on the home front, and didn't want the public to know they were sending blacks to fight on the Western Front. After 2 weeks, they boarded a troop ship named Pocahontas. The old tub was not in the best condition to transport American soldiers from New York to France. The Pocahontas set sail from the States to France 3 different times before it successfully made the trip across the Atlantic. Before being escorted off the ship into their camp, their commanding officer gave them 2 rules to be followed every second of the day. 1, keep your eyes and ears open. 2, keep your mouth shut. With flags flying and the band playing the Marseillaise, the regiment marched through the streets of the French port of Le Havre. The black band soon became the talk of the town. This inevitably marked one of the first times jazz music was heard in France. The men soon found that they would be stationed in Saint-Nazaire, far from the front lines of war. The African American men would work as laborers and solve more than a couple of problems for General Pershing. They were cheap workers, and they weren't wanted on their own soil or by other regiments that contained white soldiers. They felt more like stevedores than soldiers. General Pershing had little faith in the African American regiment, with only 2 months of the 6 months of minimum training. The regiment was angry about being sent so far away from home to do labor, but what choice did they have? After a little over a year, the soldiers had turned Saint-Nazaire completely around, making railroads and buildings more sustainable and getting much-needed supplies to troops fighting at the front. Soon the infantry learned they had been renamed from the 15th to the 369th. The new number would cause confusion and some anger, since numbers higher than 200 meant they were draftees. After all of the recruiting and volunteering the men did, the new number reflected that of soldiers who had been forced to fight for their country, despite the way they treated them at home. A soldier quoted, "The 15th had died a peaceful death." Pershing, not wanting to offend white soldiers, decided to pass the 369th over to the French.
Part of the reason they were attached to the French army was the French needed troops, and Pershing, some of the white officers in the AEF didn't want black combat troops. So to satisfy the white officers and the American Expeditionary Force, and to make the French officers happy, or French Army happy, he gave the French the 93rd Division.
It was later discovered that General Pershing had sent a letter to the French which was meant to be kept confidential. Although a citizen of the United States, the black man is regarded by the white American as an inferior being, with whom relations of business or service only are possible. We must not commend too highly the black American troops, particularly in the presence of Americans. Make a point of keeping the native cantonment population from spoiling the Negroes. Americans become greatly incensed at any public expression of intimacy between white women with black men. Familiarity on the part of white women with black men is furthermore a source of profound regret to our experienced colonials, who see in it an overwhelming menace to the prestige of the white race. It was lucky for the now 369th Infantry that the French disregarded Pershing's orders. Ultimately, the soldiers would be grateful for being dumped.
They kept their American uniforms. They turned in all their American equipment and were issued French rifles, French ammunition belts, packs, helmets, etc., and gas masks. But they kept their American uniforms. And actually by September 1918, they started wearing the American helmet by then, before the big push.
The French equipped them with new armor, uniforms, and fundamentals of the French army, even sending some troops to be educated in their war school. They better prepared the regiments for war, more so than their own country. The French order was to send a group of soldiers to the trenches at the front line for 10 days, then send in their replacements.
The 93rd Division was attached to the French Army. In fact, they never really fought as a division. Each regiment served with a different French division. The 372nd and 371st served with the 157th French Infantry Division. Since they served with the French Army and not with the American Expeditionary Force, they had a better combat record than the 92nd Division did.
They were finally ready for war. Russia's exit from the war after the fall of the Tsar meant the Germans no longer would be required to fight on two fronts. The 80 divisions of men and material that Germany had committed to fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front could now be shifted to the Western Front. Germany, for the first time, had complete superiority in strength and numbers over the Allies in Belgium and France. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, commander of the German armed forces, wrote to the Kaiser for approval of a massive new campaign in the West, saying, "No longer threatened in the rear, we could turn to the great decision in the West and must now address ourselves to the passage of arms." For weeks, von Hindenburg and his Supreme Command vied with the German diplomatic corps for the Kaiser's ear. The German Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, believed the war could not be won, and that the Kaiser should sue for peace based on U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Finally, the headstrong field marshal could take no more, issuing an ultimatum to the Kaiser in a face-to-face meeting on January 7th. His written list of demands ended with the words, "We must defeat the Western powers." After much debate, Kaiser Wilhelm capitulated, and von Hindenburg and his Supreme Command began preparing for their final stroke, a great offensive planned for spring 1917. The German army had developed stormtrooper units with infantry trained in Kutcher tactics to infiltrate and bypass enemy frontline units, leaving these strong points to be mopped up by follow-up troops.
Well, early in the war, like I said, in 1914, early 1915, it was a lot of 19th century tactics still, but with modern weaponry. Artillery had never been massed the way it has. The machine gun was obviously a tremendous killing machine for both armies, and it took lots of lives on both sides in doing these big wave assaults. Over the top, it would just slaughter all these guys. Once they realized that they needed to come up with other tactics. They decided through some early French officers and then later a German officer named Riedemann and Hauptmann Rohr helped develop what they call stormtroop tactics.
The stormtroopers' tactic was to attack and disrupt enemy headquarters, artillery units, and supply depots in the rear areas, as well as to occupy territory rapidly.
They took young men in great shape, trained them to not throw themselves against the beach, so to speak, where they would bypass strong points, almost like water running around a rock, and continue to go deeper and deeper into enemy territory. They then had follow-up troops, regular infantry, that would then engage who was ever left as far as resistance points and take them out. And then the supplies would be brought up to the next stage.
Each major formation creamed off its best and fittest soldiers into storm units. Several complete divisions were formed from these elite units.
So the storm troops were fast, fluid, almost like Mercury, to show how they would work their way through the trenches. They developed kit and implements to help them. The Germans switched from their longer Gewehr 98, which was fairly cumbersome, to a short 98 AZ carbine, which was, I guess, a foot or so shorter, so it was less unwieldy in the trenches when they had to deal with it. They got extensive training with hand grenade tactics in rolling up trenches and to capture sections of trenches. They would bring extra sandbags and shovels. You see pictures of guys with long-handled shovels on their back. So once they got into a section of enemy trench, they would consolidate that area and make it a strong point, so it would make it harder for the British or the French or the Americans to try to retake that area. So once the rest of the army caught up with them, they would just keep moving forward until they ran out of steam and were stopped at some point, or they were ordered to stop and consolidate what they had at that point and then move on further.
This process gave the German army an initial advantage in the attack, but meant that the best formations would suffer disproportionately heavy casualties, while the quality of the formations, stripped of their best personnel, declined. To enable the initial breakthrough, Lieutenant Colonel George Bruckmüller, a German artillery officer, developed the Führerwalze, an effective and economical artillery bombardment scheme. There were three phases: a brief attack on the enemy's command and communications, destruction of their artillery, and lastly, an attack upon the enemy frontline infantry defenses. Bombardment would always be brief so as to retain surprise. Bruckmüller's tactics were made possible by the vast numbers of heavy guns, with correspondingly plentiful amounts of ammunition for them, which Germany possessed by 1918. It was possible for the Germans to launch an offensive at almost any vital part of the front without giving the Allies notice of their intentions by moving guns and shells to the threatened sector. At 20 minutes to 5 on the morning of March 21st, the moonless, fog-bound pre-dawn stillness along the Western Front was shattered by the thunder of more than 6,000 German artillery guns. Along a 50-mile front, the 6,000 guns, more than a third of which were classified as heavy and super heavy, rained terror and death on the British 3rd and 5th Armies. This was the opening salvo of the great German offensive that its architects believed would bring a swift end to the war on the Western Front. The artillery barrage was the inspiration of Lieutenant Colonel George Bruckmüller, and it included not just explosive ordnance, but canisters of mustard gas as well. At first, the German artillery fire was concentrated on the Allied artillery. Then, after an hour, the gunners resighted their guns and began concentrating on the Allied front lines. At 7 a.m., the shelling ended. For an hour and a half, the British troops waited for the German assault. At 9:40 a.m., after an intense 5-minute mortar barrage, the assault came. More than 1 million German troops in 3 armies poured into the no-man's land between the front lines. This all-out assault in the northeast of France was patterned by General Erich Ludendorff to end the war quickly, with a mighty push to Paris before the Americans could join the fight. For a week, it looked as though Ludendorff might succeed. Fighting in close coordination with Bruckmüller's artillery, the German infantry made huge gains for the first time in 4 years, driving the British lines back for miles along the 50-mile front. The British had only 28 divisions in the area that was attacked. Ludendorff had assembled 76 divisions to make the attack, 32 of which took part in the initial infantry assault at 9:40 a.m. on March 21st. The British units were forced out of their front line along most of the front, and the Germans even broke through the second line of defense to the battle zone along a quarter of the 50-mile front. The attack hit the Fifth Army hardest. To the north, the attack on the Third Army made less progress, but did threaten to cut off the British troops left on the salient following the Battle of Cambrai. By March 24th, the British were being forced even further west, threatening to open a gap between the British and French armies. Pétain, commander of the French armies of the north, visited Haig to warn him that he expected to be attacked at Verdun and could therefore spare no more reinforcements to help the British. Haig communicated his fears of a possible collapse of his army to the War Office and requested a high-level delegation visit France. He also suggested placing General Foch in overall command of Allied operation. Foch's appointment to that position ended any danger of a rift between the Allies. Meanwhile, the German advance soon began to run out of steam as the units involved became increasingly exhausted. Captured British supply dumps, far better provisioned than the blockaded Germans, slowed down the advance when the troops settled in to forage for much-needed supplies.
They had overextended their lines of supply. They had met such success that they advanced tremendously far. The men were exhausted. They were continually being pushed to go further, They captured large stocks of British supplies, food that they hadn't seen in a long time, and liquor. So in some cases, whole units were drunk and tearing into every bit of food they could get their hands on before the officers could go in and get them back in line. But for the most part, they overextended themselves. They couldn't get their supplies to keep that inertia going, that forward movement where they could keep rolling up, and they suffered heavy casualties. They were losing the cream of the crop of their stormtroops that were getting killed and wounded as they continually advanced to the point where they were decimated to the point where their effectiveness was not the same as it was when the offensive started.
The German attack continued to the end of March. The first 3 days of April were quiet, and when the fighting was renewed on April 4th, both sides launched attacks. Finally, on April 5th, Ludendorff recognized that the Great Offensive had failed and canceled any further attacks. The German army had lost between 200 and 300,000 men without achieving their objectives. But just as Schlieffen's armies had outrun their supply trains in 1914, Ludendorff too proved too fast and too successful for his own good. Caught up in their early successes against the British, they simply outran their artillery support. Without artillery to soften the lines ahead of them and debilitate the British resistance, the assault ground to a halt. Stalled at the Somme, Ludendorff turned his armies north toward Flanders, where they were rebuffed again. In desperation, he sent his men back south against the French at the Marne River. But now the Germans were dangerously low on manpower and supplies, and waiting for them alongside the French and British were the Americans. Even after the failure of the Noyon-Montdidier offensive, Ludendorff was still determined to launch his great attack in Flanders. The third offensive, on the Aisne, had left an awkward salient in the line around the fortified city of Reims, and so Ludendorff decided to launch a two-pincer attack, with attacks east and west of the city. Once Reims had been taken and the line straightened out, the Flanders offensive could begin. This was the final significant German offensive of the war. East of Reims, it failed on the first day. West of Reims, some progress was made, and the Germans established a 4-mile-deep beachhead across the Marne. The 5 costly offensives had bled the German army of at least 800,000 casualties, many in the elite units used to spearhead the attacks. In many areas, the new German front line was only weakly held, with newly constructed defenses that lacked the strength and depth familiar in 1915 through 1917. In 1917, all of Europe was on the verge of bankruptcy, yet the Great War went on. Broken and war-weary, the Allies had one hope: fresh troops in America. The problem with this great tide of enthusiasm, though, was that it was based on an utterly mistaken assumption. For America, in truth, had no military might. In April 1916, the United States was as poorly prepared to go to war as any nation in history. It ranked in size 17th in the world. The U.S. Army had fewer than 135,000 troops. The U.S. Marine Corps had only a few thousand men. These troops were not organized or trained for combat, and they lacked even the most basic supplies.
Not very many units actually were fully trained, because they would form these divisions and then they'd get ready to ship one overseas and they would pull people out of the other one. So very few of them had had much training at all. And then toward the end, there were guys literally who'd been drafted and they'd never fired a rifle or anything. I ran across one, I think it was in the 77th Division. They had these guys coming in to join it, and a sergeant was charging one 5 francs to show him how to load his rifle. He'd been in the Army about 4 weeks or something. So it was a rush thing. And of course, one reason, a lot of these guys are going to get killed because they didn't know what in the world was going on.
Yet the brash young Yanks chafed at the bit to prove themselves, and their chance would come soon enough.
The initial groups of Marines that came over, the grand majority of them actually had enlisted prior to the declaration of war. So they had signed on previously for the adventure, and then that changed. But it was about our core, our reason for existence. We're going to go ahead and support that. Now, there's a wide variety of people who enlisted in the Marine Corps. There were definitely still those who it was the only hope that they could have to get a paying job, was to sign over 4 years of their life and go aboard a ship and learn to be a Marine. But by the time of the early 20th century, there was a lot of an impetus for individuals who went, you know what, I don't want to live in Bloomington, Indiana anymore. My parents lived here and my grandparents lived here, and they've been running the same farm for all these years. Now, a lot of them just go to cities, but there was a portion of them that went, I want to see the world. And they go and enlist and join the Marine Corps. And then, of course, you still have the leadership elements, the old NCOs who had fought in the Philippines, who had marched on Samar, who had fought in Cuba, who had been across the briny ocean many times. And they had their experiences to leaven and to lead these sorts of men. I hope that answers the question. I try to put it in a parlance. It wasn't a purely this low social class were in the Marine Corps. There were definitely some of those, but it went through all levels of society at that time, which makes it a very unique experience.
With the Germans advancing on the Marne in the vicinity of Chateau Thierry, Major General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, was ordered by Allied command to move his 2nd and 3rd Divisions into that area to shore up the French resistance there under French command.
We were trained, and we were trained right down to the bone. We awaited the call. We were no jingos, or we were no screamers around for this or that, but we were trained for war. That was our profession, the regular Marines. And we didn't like the waiting behind the line.
We practically broke open a bottle of champagne when the word came that we were to move the next 48 hours somewhere. We didn't care where. We'd had enough of this business of play acting. We wanted to get somewhere where we could do some damage and get done, get back home.
The 2nd Division comprised 2 brigades, 1 Army and 1 Marine, and totaled about 26,000 men. They rode all day and through the night in transport trucks to reach the lines. On June 1st, Marine Captain Lloyd Williams took up forward positions north of the village of Bussy-les-Bocages near the Belleau Wood. When their French commanders advised them that they were too far forward and should pull back, Captain Williams replied, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here."
That is correct, sir. The name of the officer fails me, but it's a company commander who's in the 6th Marines, who he's basically told by a passing French officer or a liaison officer that this area of the battle was lost.
On the 2nd and 3rd of June, the 5th Marines sporadically exchanged long-range rifle fire with lead elements of the German force in the woods. Belleau Wood, which had been the private hunting reserve for the nearby chateau, was a carefully tended forest with little undergrowth. Its trees, most less than 6 inches in diameter, were so close together that visibility into and through the wood was limited. It was a perfect place for an army, the German army, to take up defensive positions and conceal its numbers.
But the difficulty with Belleau Wood was you never knew where the front was. Little groups of men, of Americans, little groups of Germans got together to fight each other. And while you were fighting in one direction, all of a sudden, without any warning, you would find that there were some Germans to the rear of you, and they had to be mopped up. Clean up, mop up, and move ahead, move ahead.
On June 4th, the Germans attacked the left flank of the American lines from Belleau Wood to the north, engaging the Marines 2nd and 5th at and around Les Mares Farm. With their artillery and machine gun support in place, the Marines were able to repulse the German attack. On the following day, the French command ordered the Marines to take the Belleau Wood. So eager were the Marines to go after the Germans that at 3:45 a.m. on June 6th, when the commander of the Marines reached the front line to give the attack order, many of his men already were 25 yards out and moving forward at double time. As the Marines rushed into the open green wheat field between their lines and the wood, they were met by a hail of German machine gun fire from the cover of the trees. Captain George Hamilton, commander of the 49th Marine Company, rushed among his command, rallying his troops, urging them forward into the wood. There was also a legendary Marine gunnery sergeant, Dan Daly, pushing his men forward.
Well, if you can imagine, Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, winner of the holder of 2 Medals of Honor, standing up despite the German bullets and yelling to all of these men to his left and right, "Get up, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" Resets their mind and they go, well, if that old codger, who is always giving me grief over my buttons not being polished, my weapon not being clean, if he can get up and go do it, well, damn it, I can do it as well.
When the decimated Marine units reached the wood, they plunged in with bayonets fixed. The German troops, stunned at the ferocity of the assault, called the Marines Teufelhunden, or devil dogs. Most of the Kaiser's troops surrendered in fright.
You could also say that the Marines went into it. There were individuals, officers and senior NCOs who knew what battle was, who knew what was going to happen, but the grand majority hadn't experienced what is the combat of the Western Front or combat of that type yet. And really they were the young hunting dog out for the first time. So when they ran forward, it was, we're going. We have the pride of our nation and the pride of the Marine Corps to keep going, mixed in with an exuberance that they didn't know how bad it was going to be. So they rush in, take horrific casualties, but because of that shock, they're able to gain that toehold in Belleau Wood. And once the battalions of the 6th Marines are able to take their places, that begins a new phase of the battle, more of an open, not in a trench, but fighting in amongst the trees and in the towns and on open fields, which is a different kind of experience than what had been the previous almost 4 years of war at that point.
One by one, the German machine guns fell silent. American runners came back from the woods carrying notes to HQ from the unit leaders in the wood that their objectives had been taken. As the machine guns fell silent, the wounded in the wheat field short of the wood began crawling back toward the American trenches. Because of the way they were ordered to advance across open ground, Marine casualties in the Belleau Wood on June 6, 1918, were the highest in the history of the Corps.
I'd like to point two things about Belleau Wood. The assault in Belleau Wood was the largest number of casualties that the Marine Corps experienced in one day up till that point. And the killed and wounded in that that first day's battle on the 6th of June was more than all Marines who had previously died in combat in the United States history in one day.
The fight for the Belleau Wood would continue for most of the month of June. For the Marines who fought there, and for all those who would wear the uniforms after them, it was one of the Corps' proudest moments, and it showed the Germans that the Americans were ready to fight. By the fall of 1918, German troop strength was declining to a critical level. In 6 months, the strength of the Kaiser's army had fallen from 5.1 million to 4.2 million. The army's discontent with its leadership was beginning to find a voice.
I went through the streets of Frankfurt and was not saluted. I was a commissioned officer, and in the German army the order was we had to be saluted. It was not the only soldier I met who didn't salute, but there were quite a number who refused to salute. I realized that the discipline and the mood of the people was really bad. We hadn't realized it at the front, how bad it was at home. People were fed up with war. They wanted the war to be ended as soon as possible, victory or no victory.
Staff officers began circulating a paper calling for negotiations with the Allies to be initiated at once. On August 30th, General John Pershing achieved his purpose of bringing the American First Army into being. It was immediately deployed south of Verdun, opposite the tangled and waterlogged ground of the Saint-Mihiel salient, which had been in German hands since 1914. On September 12th, Pershing launched the first all-American offensive of the war. In a single day, the American 1st and 4th Corps drove the Germans from their positions, capturing 466 guns and taking 13,251 prisoners. After 4 years of a war in which they had destroyed the Tsar's army, trounced the Italians and Romanians, demoralized the French, and, at the very least, denied the British a clear-cut victory, the Germans were now confronted by an army whose soldiers sprang in uncountable numbers, as if from soil sown with dragon's teeth. A sense of the pointlessness of further effort rotted the resolution of the ordinary German soldier. Reports began coming into Ludendorff's headquarters of German troops surrendering to a single soldier or isolated squadron. Suddenly, he saw the war as hopeless. In the presence of King Wilhelm, he blamed the defeat on lack of discipline. Wilhelm countered Ludendorff's comment, complaining that too much had been asked of the troops. A telegram from Emperor Karl of Austria was handed to Wilhelm. The Austrian emperor informed his ally that the war must be ended in 1918. Otherwise, he, Karl, would conclude a separate peace. Wilhelm, shaken with head bowed, informed Hindenburg and Ludendorff that the war must be ended. Foreign Minister Hintze stated that he wished for a peace based on President Wilson's 14 points, hoping this would prevent revolution in Germany. He suggested the creation of a new parliamentary government and making Wilhelm a constitutional monarch. Wilhelm reluctantly accepted, believing this might help save his throne, and he signed a decree granting new powers to Germany's parliament. On October 3rd, Prince Max of Baden, Wilhelm's cousin, was sworn in as the chancellor of a new parliamentary government. The chancellor was now responsible to Parliament rather than to Wilhelm. The question of war and peace would now be the responsibility of Parliament, representatives of the German people. On October 4th, the new government sent its request for an armistice to the Allies.
To avoid further bloodshed, the German government requests the President to arrange the immediate conclusion of an armistice on land, by sea, and in the air.
Wilson's reply to the German request for an armistice arrived in Berlin on October 9th. Wilson asked whether the new government spoke for the German Empire, and if so, whether it was prepared to accept his 14 points unconditionally. By now, Ludendorff and Hindenburg had stopped supporting a negotiated settlement and were distancing themselves from any compromise settlement or surrender to Allied demands. Rather than seeing the war as lost, Ludendorff was now for fighting on the defensive through 1919. He and the German Admiralty insisted that submarine warfare continue. On October 20th, Hindenburg told Prince Max that his government should keep Germany fighting for our honor to the very last man. And if this resulted in Germany breaking off negotiations with Wilson, said Hindenburg, so be it. A third note arrived in Germany from Wilson on October 23rd, with Wilson demanding that if Germany's military masters, including Wilhelm, were still in power, they had to step aside, that the United States would negotiate only with representatives of the German people. On October 26th, during a shouting match between Wilhelm and Ludendorff, Ludendorff resigned, complaining later that Hindenburg, who was present, had made no attempt to defend him, and was therefore guilty of treachery. In Berlin, the Chancellor, Prince Max, saw the writing on the wall and acted on his own by announcing the abdication of Wilhelm and his sons. Then Max resigned as Chancellor, handing the government to the leader of the Social Democrats, Friedrich Ebert. Wilhelm refused to accept what he called a coup d'etat, but his refusal was without effect. On November 10th, the House of Hohenzollern fell, rejecting suggestions that he should seek death in the trenches as incompatible with his position as head of the German Lutheran Church. Wilhelm II departed by train to exile in Holland, never to forgive Hindenburg for what he called his disloyalty. At 5 a.m. on Monday morning, November 11th, 1918, 9 grim men agreed to sign the papers laid out on a table in a railroad carriage parked in a forest 37 miles north of Paris. At 5:12, 2 French generals, 3 British naval officers, 2 German politicians, a German general, and a German naval officer started signing the armistice, which would end the World War that had raged for more than 4 years. The last signature was in place by 5:20, making it official. At 11 o'clock, all fighting would cease. By 5:40 a.m., the news of the signing had reached the capital cities, where impromptu celebrations broke out. Big Ben rang out in London for the first time since 1914.
We had had so many years of suffering. 4 years of dull suffering, acute suffering, pain everywhere. It was dreadful. Every day we heard about somebody we loved being killed, being wounded. There was no relief anywhere, and we thought it would go on and on and on forever. But it didn't, because armistice came.
And we carried on into Mons and got to the main street, which was filled with the inhabitants, screaming their heads off and shouting. I didn't seem to know what had happened to them. And as I got to the town hall in the main street of Mons, the church clocks chimed. It was 11 o'clock.
Slowly, the news came in officially that an armistice had been signed. But there was no show of emotion. No one went berserk or anything like that. We were too far gone. I mean, say, the perceptions, our emotions were all killed long ago.
Although it took longer for the soldiers in the trenches to get the news, the generals along the Western Front knew the armistice would be signed at 5 a.m. and that fighting would stop 6 hours later. Until then, they were determined to gain favorable positions should the ceasefire fail, and, not incidentally, to continue to punish the Germans up until the very last minute. Generals under American General Pershing launched attacks as late as 10:30 a.m. Some French units were ordered to attack at 9 a.m. and cease at 11. The British attacked, relishing the idea of recapturing Mons, Belgium, on the last day of the war. Mons was the site of their first battle and first defeat in August 1914. Artillery batteries fired salvo after salvo into the German lines, simply to avoid having to haul the unused shells away. On that morning of November 11th, while the world started to celebrate and word continued to filter down to the troops that the fighting would cease at 11, there were almost 11,000 casualties, including nearly 2,700 killed. British Empire losses that morning were around 2,400. 40-year-old Private George Edwin Ellison was the last British soldier to die at 9:30 as he scouted the outskirts of Mons, the same place where the first British soldier had died. George was one of the few old soldiers who had been shipped across the Channel in 1914 and had fought at Mons in September of that year. Against all odds, he had survived over 4 years in the trenches to be killed 90 minutes before the end of the fighting. The last Canadian to die was 25-year-old Private George Lawrence Price. He was shot by a sniper at 10:58. American losses that morning were estimated as high as 3,500. Some of Pershing's generals saw a last chance at glory, and believing the armistice was letting the Germans off the hook, Pershing did nothing to dissuade them. U.S. Marines suffered more than 1,100 casualties trying to cross the River Meuse. Had they been allowed to wait until 11 o'clock, they could have safely crossed the river with no casualties. Henry Gunther of Baltimore, Maryland was the last American and the last Allied soldier to be killed. He and others advanced through the fog toward 2 German machine guns. The Germans fired a burst over their heads, and the Americans dropped to the ground. The Germans, knowing that it was almost 11 o'clock, assumed that would be the end of it. But Gunther got back up and started running at them. The Germans shouted and waved at him to stop, but when he didn't, they fired a burst of 5 shots. One of them struck Gunther in the left temple, killing him instantly. It was 10:59, 60 seconds before the end of the war. German losses that morning were about 4,100, as many of them were retreating and therefore more exposed. Surviving German records are not clear about the last German killed in the war, but the last German and last soldier killed may have been a Lieutenant Thomas. After 11 o'clock, he approached some American soldiers to let them know that since the war was over, he and his men were vacating a house and it would be available. Unfortunately, no one had informed the Americans of the armistice, and they shot him. In a war of unprecedented carnage and destruction, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers were ordered out of the relative safety of their squalid trenches to walk unprotected across open land toward enemy machine guns, it may seem that the morning of the last day was just more of the same. It is only when taken out of the context of that war and compared to another even larger war that its true horror emerges. For on that morning, with only a few hours to endure, when all the generals had to do was nothing, more men were killed, wounded, or missing than both sides suffered on D-Day in June 1944 during the Normandy invasion.
There'd been one German machine gun unit giving our troops a lot of trouble, and they kept on firing until practically 11 o'clock. And at 11 o'clock, the officer stepped out of their position, stood up, lifted his helmet and bowed to the British troops, fell all his men in the open in front and marched them off.
As the guns fell silent, the slaughter came to an end in no man's land.
No flash of howitzers on the horizon, no downward droning of the shells, no machine guns, no patrols going out, just nothing. Silence.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes and such, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Who wouldn't join the army? That's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. Wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as Reveille is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Home for the right turn, how will we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pay. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. What? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Come for us, retard, we spend the money we earn. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.